All right, thanks a lot, Lee and panelists. Coming up next, we have Jim with ADVA talking about in-flight encryption. While Jim makes his way up to the stage, we're going to hand out a PlayStation 4 to our lucky survey winner. Is Ryan Vaughn in the room? Ryan Vaughn. There he is. You should be able to pick it. All right. Special thanks out to Gaikai for the giveaway prize. You should be able to get it at the Nanog registration desk. Thanks. And I will hand this over to Jim of ADVA. Thanks, Jim. There's your go forward button right there.
All right, Jim Theodoras, ADVA Optical Networking. I'm going to talk about in-flight encryption today. And I'm going to start, as I always do, with the OSI model, because no matter where you are, what you do with networking, you belong somewhere on this diagram. And we talk a lot about the transport of data between 2 points. In reality, you may be transporting bits, frames, packets, segments, or data, depending on which layer you reside at. And I like to shade this from green at the bottom to red at the top in reference to the additional power it takes. The higher up in the stack you go to do anything, it's a lot less efficient. You burn a lot more power, costs a lot more dollars, takes a lot more space, but you can do a lot of really cool things. The lower down in the stack you go, it's a lot more efficient to do it, but it becomes more difficult to do fancy things. So when I'm talking in-flight encryption, what I'm really talking about, you need to get data from point A to point B, and you want to do it securely. Now, the stuff we do in our data centers is at very high layers. That means to go from point A to point B, we're going down the stack. And unless you're running a bridging protocol like IWARP, you're going to walk down and up the stack in multiple places. So that's a lot of going up and down. And at least until recently, we thought, well, IPsec is the solve-all. If I run IPsec, then I'm secure. But when you think about it, your traffic is going so many different places. You're going up and down layers. So many people are handling that. It's maybe asking much that just 2 endpoint IPsecs are going to protect that. And the analogy I like to use is from my past. So a long time ago, like 20 years ago, I bought my first home for my family, and I was so proud the realtor handed me that key. And every night I locked that front door, and I made sure that I had that key, and I felt so secure with that key. But then later it dawned on me, well, my wife left a key under the doormat for the maid. I'd given a copy of the key to the neighbor for when we're on vacation. I never bothered to rekey the lock when I bought the house. One day I came home, the previous owner had been kicked out from his wife and was sitting on my couch drinking a beer, watching the game, and just kind of thought he'd move back in. And the yard wasn't gated. So move on to today in a new house. I've got multiple layers of security. So there's a lockbox for the key for the maid. I've rekeyed it before I moved in. The yard's gated. And alarm, this intrusion detection. It's not enough to have layers. I've locked this, I've locked this, I've locked that. You need to also detect intrusion. So for secure end-to-end data transfer, you really have to have proper key management. You have to have multiple layers of security, and then you need to detect if an intrusion really has occurred. That's how you secure end-to-end transport. So when we talk layer security, you see it in all the Hollywood movies. It's not a Hollywood plot device. It's really used, it works, not because you can't get through all the layers, but your purpose is to make it so inconvenient that people will just maybe go attack the house next door. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sideways attacks. So in talking sideways attack, let's talk about the concept of mathematical sleight of hand. And that is when the human brain is faced with really big numbers, we think, wow, that's really big, I bet that's really secure. And the opposite occurs with the lottery. You say, wow, that's a really small number, I bet I can really win there. In reality, the probability is very small. So it works both ways. And here I've got an example of a master lock. There's 64,000 possible combinations. In reality, sideways attacks, just by moving the dial and clicking the clasp up and down, you can reduce that to 100 possible combinations. So really your master lock has 100 possible combinations. And that's ignoring what would be a backdoor attack, which is basically you take a aluminum can and you cut a shim out of it, slide it down the clasp, and it pops open. So that would be a backdoor attack. Some other examples of sideways attacks, encryption keys, they need to be stored in very special memory that can be wiped immediately, and not just when power is out, but wiped when any given set of conditions occurs. So in this case, if your encryption keys are in DRAM, DRAM decays rather fast. Unless you hit it with freeze spray, then it decays very slowly. You simply freeze the part, you pop the card, you read the value, you've got a key, and now keys don't change it often. You can get into some place you weren't supposed to get into. Another example of a sideways attack is what I call not so random numbers, and that is, hardware random number generation is pretty random, but it's slow, and so it's often used as a seed for a pseudo-random number, and if you know how that pseudo-random number is generated, then it reduces the possible solution set. That's known as lack of entropy in passwords, and it can have very dramatic effects, especially if you're running AES encryption. So here's an example of that. A brute force attack means I'm just going to try everything I can until I get the answer. So brute forcing would be use a high-performance computer, you go through every possible key combination, but the trick is you don't really have to go through every permutation, you only have to go through every guess. And relational data, especially in this day and age of social media, dramatically reduces the entropy of those passwords. So here's an example. A supercomputer we could never ever build, one that can check 10 to the 18th keys per second and would still require 10 to the 51 years to find all the key space of a 256 AES. Pretty secure, right? Well, again, the trick is you don't look for every key, you look for every possible password. In a typical mining rig that I can build today for less than $10,000, I can brute force 30 billion passwords per second, and I can crack all known 8-character passwords in just a few hours. Now, if you add on top of that relational data that you can gather from social media that people maintain today, or just anything known about this particular solution set, you can crack this in mere minutes. So this password there at the bottom, I actually went into a hacker forum, and a person running a password mining rig, he actually did the reverse problem. He said, well, what would be the password that would be the hardest for my mining rig to solve for? And this was one of the 4 passwords he spit out in various runs. So unless your password looks like that one on the bottom, you're probably not as secure as you think you are. So I wanted to talk about the goals of cryptography, because everyone thinks cryptography is about the secret decoder ring. I'm going to make it so secret, and I'm going to hide that ring, and no one will ever figure out what the contents are. But to really be secure, you need to go beyond confidentiality, and you need to worry about the integrity. Can I detect if someone doesn't steal it, but just changes it a little bit? And then authenticity. Is the person I'm talking to, is the person I just handed that key really the person I should have handed the key to? So we'll just look at those real quickly. So you got Alice talking to Bob, and Eve's a naughty girl. She wants to listen in on it. Well, confidentiality would be Eve's not able to understand the message of Alice, but encryption does not protect against manipulation. She could go into that data and say, well, that $10 transfer is now a $100,000 transfer. Also, encryption, and if it's not done right, it can't detect manipulation. If you use a cryptographic checksum, now you can solve the issue of, I know this message has been modified. And then authentication prevents phishing. So if someone's pretending to be Eve, if Eve's pretending to be Bob, you can figure that out and know, hey, I'm not going to send them my data. So you have to have all 3, or there's really no point in trying to encrypt. So we're going to talk about encryption basics now. So symmetric encryption, it's when you use the same algorithm, the same key, and you exchange keys. I'm old enough to remember that was called sneakernet, because you used to take a key and you would FedEx it from one side to the other. So your algorithm is running electronically over your data link, but maybe the key was FedExed in an envelope. So the disadvantage is you must both have the same key, and you've got to keep it secret. Somehow you have to get it from one end to the other without it being intercepted. So AES works on that, symmetric encryption. It just round robins through. Now, if you did it on block by block basis, it turns out it's not very secure. You've all seen the penguin diagram where a penguin with block encryption still looks like a penguin even though it's been encrypted. So we don't do it on block boundaries but across the whole payload. So it turns out symmetric encryption is fast. We still use it. Asymmetric encryption is, well, I'm going to generate a key pair with public and a private key. The public key can be distributed everywhere, but then there's the private key. Works a lot better, but it's also a lot slower, takes a lot more horsepower. So with the public key, you intentionally use an algorithm that makes it really difficult and takes a long time, a lot of processing power to then calculate what that key is. And in this case, we use a Diffie-Hellman algorithm. So if we look at the summary chart here, so asymmetric requires secure channel? No, but it's slow. And can it be implemented in FPGA hardware? Only partially. Can you encrypt a large amount of data? You're probably not going to use that for 100 gig links. If you look at symmetric encryption, well, it requires a secure channel, but you know, it's pretty fast. I can put it in FPGA, and I can use it for line rate data, whether it be 10, 40, or 100 gig. So what we do is we combine both methods. You get the best of both worlds. Symmetric encryption for the data, because it can be line rate, and then asymmetric encryption of the keys, and you get the benefit of both. So let's look at various encryption methods. So this is going higher layer to lowest layer. You can do IPsec. You can buy a big security appliance and do it and attach that to your routers. Or you can integrate it in your layer 1 transport gear, which is a lot more efficient. So if there's only one slide that sticks with you today, or one thing you take away from this, slide is probably it. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. And that's encryption method versus layer. So I've organized this from layer 3 on down to layer 1. At the highest layer, doing the most OTV, overlay transport virtualization. So in this, you've got you're encrypting a piece of it. So it has a very large overhead. You're adding 82 bytes to your packet. But it's used for common IPVPN services. And the key takeaway here is that you are encrypting the payload, but only part of the header, and the checksum is not part of the encryption, and you've got that 82-byte overhead. So let's move down the stack. Let's look at MACsec or TrustSec. So here I'm adding 32 or 40 bytes respectively. It's hop by hop only, at least currently. There's things on the drawing board to extend that across hops. Again, 32 bytes overhead. I am, in this case, encrypting the entire header, which is fantastic, but my checksum isn't included with that. So, okay, Nadia, let's go down to basic transport. So today, most transport encryption involves encrypting only the payload. The header's not touched, the checksum's not touched. But in its advantage, there's no bytes of overhead, so you have maximum throughput. So when I talk in-flight encryption, what I'm talking about is bulk encryption. You take the whole shebang and you encrypt it. And in doing so, you have 0 bytes overhead, so you have maximum throughput. And in this case, the checksum's included, so suddenly I can do integrity. I know if that person on the other end, if the message has been manipulated and who's on the other end. So it has a lot of advantages. So if this is a graph of maximum throughput, and this just shows, it's oversimplified. The more overhead you have, the less efficient you are as packet sizes get smaller. Obviously, if you have an 82-byte overhead, and your packet ends up being only 64 bytes long, that's not very efficient. So if you have variable packet sizes, then doing bulk encryption or even encryption at the transport layer is going to help you keep maximum throughput versus packet size. So an advantage of bulk encryption or in-flight encryption is that you can carry any content within it, because you're just taking what is spit out, the bulk of it, and you're encrypting it. So that means within that container, you can still have fiber channel, InfiniBand, 1 gig, 10 gig, 100 gig, 40 gig. You can have all those protocols residing within that container, and then you bulk encrypt it, and you've got maximum throughput. So we will be having in Beers and Gears today, just after this, later this evening, we'll be having a live demonstration of 100 gigabit per second encryption between a sender and receiver with an intruder eavesdropping on that, showing how the encryption works. And I've just learned all flights are canceled out of Atlanta airport, so where are you going to go anyway? Come have some beer, have some snacks on us, and see this live demo. It's really pretty cool. So I did want to touch on quantum key distribution and why all the hype there. It tends to be kind of this esoteric thing, and it's something that, you know, the tinfoil hat people are playing with in labs, various places, and why the hype is. I wanted to explain why there's so much hype about that. And one obvious aspect is you've got, you know, entangled photons that, due to a quantum effect, they're instantaneously transported from one site to the other. And the cool thing is, if you mess with one, you mess with the other one, you can tell if anyone taps it because it changes. So I've got authenticity down there. I can tell if anyone's trying to mess with anything. So intrusion detection, reading the key changes it. But what's often overlooked is that the key is truly random. It prevents sidewaysing or brute force attacks because the process of transmitting those entangled photons scrambles and randomizes it to where it has a perfect random nature to it. So quantum key distribution has a lot of benefits. It's not as esoteric as it used to be, and at OFC this year, just next month, we're going to be talking about a real-world example over a real customer's fiber of quantum key distribution for the keys that then feed this 100 gig encryption that I was talking about. So I did want to touch on some of the recent vulnerabilities that have been exposed. Well, I have to say, while maybe I'm a bit naive, but while I fully support what has come out recently from our government standpoint, I'm more worried about what others might do with that. And it's kind of a balancing act. If encryption is too hard to break, then you basically give threats total anonymity, which is probably not a good thing. But if encryption is too easy to break, then threats have access to all your data, and some teenager living in his parents' basement in Russia may have access to all your credit card data, as happened recently. So it's kind of a balancing act between the two. So I'm going to go through some specific examples that have come out recently. So if you're running a cloud, you really need to treat all internal data like it's external, even if you think it's internal to your private network. One breach exposes your entire network to everything. And here's an example. I've circled kind of in red there what was seen to be inside of a private network, but it's an external connection between two buildings, non-encrypted. And doing that, you might as well say, well, I'm opening my kimono to everyone in the world. So assume there will be a breach and design accordingly. You shouldn't assume a single point of attack either. Between data centers, it can be in an undersea cable, it can be at a colo site, it can be in a shared fiber, and at various peering access points, all data is probably being copied off. So you need to secure all your links. And this is something I really want to touch on here. We all think of, well, the user connects to the cloud. I've got my laptop or my smartphone, everything's in the cloud, and I'm connecting to that cloud. In reality, the cloud's all around us. When we connect to it, our data now becomes global the second it's uploaded. And this is actually a specific example. This came from NBC News, and it shows a real example of where someone had a VPN link to a cloud provider, but then within seconds of that data being uploaded, it was distributed all over the globe. And then one of these, the entity searched for one of these links that maybe was compromised, and there's a whole bunch of them, and it's relatively trivial to find something in that whole cloud of connectivity around us to where it really didn't matter that they were VPN'd into that cloud provider. Your data becomes global the minute it's uploaded. I also want to touch on IPsec. So before the revelations came out, the chair of that effort, Gilmore, came out publicly with a letter saying he felt uncomfortable that it was sort of compromised from day one. And examples he gave, not mine, is that the same initialization vector is used throughout a session. It's better to rotate and roll those initialization vectors. Null encryption was put in as option. What that is you can go flip a bit and the payload will run unencrypted, but both ends think it's still encrypted. That's much easier to decrypt IPsec now because my worm or my little bug doesn't have to fully decrypt, which takes a lot of processing power. I just have to locate a bit and flip it, and then everything from point to point is unencrypted, and I can just do bulk transfer. 56-bit DES and Diffie-Hellman were seen as not necessarily the most secure options available. And he claims FreeS and WAN's Linux implementation was never secure since day one, wasn't part of the efforts. And if you're using those, hopefully you've written your own thing. So what we need to understand, at the time IPsec was written, processing power was a lot less than it is today. And so at the time, there was this worry that there'd be total anonymity to anyone running IPsec. And so maybe these hooks were put in because of the fear of the total anonymity. The problem is today, there's so much processing power that IPsec has become much more easy to crack, and so you have to take measures to understand its limitations, and then you can use IPsec and it's fine. The example given recently was BULLRUN. This was a way that traffic can be diverted and decrypted in real time and deciphered immediately just by request. So this is always sitting online. A request comes in, boom, it's decrypted at will. So understand that. I did want to touch on the topic of penetrating private networks. So there's this assumption, hey, I've got this data center and it's not even connected to the internet. So I'm golden. It's not even go anywhere. Everyone that comes in, they've got to have their badge. No smartphones or electronics are allowed in. I've got a gate you have to walk through. I'm secure. Everyone's had background checks. How can my data possibly leak out of this data center? And it turns out it's actually pretty easy because and this is an example given recently, a shipment of USB cables from Cables to Go was made, shipped Amazon Prime, and all they had to do was intercept that Amazon Prime shipment, swap out one batch of USB cables with a different batch of USB cables. Inside of those USB cables was a small RF transmitter that then broadcasted that to nearby receivers. So don't assume that if you are, strip searching employees and no smartphones are allowed and you're not connected to the internet that your data is necessarily secure. You have to take other measures as well. So back to the OSI model here. This is kind of where vulnerabilities exist today, going up from layer 1. So fiber optic cable taps, most undersea cables are tapped. You just need to assume they are and then design around that. Coastal gateways are usually replicated. Moving up the layer, one tactic is inside of switches you can instigate an artificial flood or multicast command so that a tap on one port gets to see all data coming in. Co-location sites are often copied off. You move up a layer, there's Fed mandated access, which is okay, but there's vulnerabilities have been inserted in IPsec. Moving up, there's non-randomness of numbers, key intercept, mandated backdoors, cookies, malware. I mean, there's vulnerabilities everywhere, but if you understand where those are and you educate yourself and your staffs, you can work around those. So, I mean, so if I wanted to secure end-to-end transport, I've got 2 facilities, I want to get stuff from point A to point B, well, I'd secure the facilities. That includes RF shielding. I'd run intrusion detection so that if my fiber is tapped, rather than just counting on my keys to protect it, I can detect, hey, someone has tapped my line. You want to then look at the whole stack where your data is flowing. And at the higher layers, you want to run Tor or Onion type servers. They're not uncrackable. Part of the revelation was how they're cracked, but it's difficult. So only nation states are pretty much going to crack that. Most hackers won't. That's why it's used for Bitcoin. You want to run IPsec despite the shortcomings. If you have good key generation and it's implemented properly, IPsec can be a valid security tool. You want to run MaxSec. It's traditionally point-to-point. There's extensions coming along that will make that multi-point. That can be a very valid tool as well. You want to run the in-flight bulk encryption that I've talked about and that we're running. You want to run all of these. So basically, you want to run it at all layers. It's back to that Oceans 11, 12, 13 example, Hollywood layering of security in my house example there. So recommendations, layer your security. You want to encrypt at every layer when possible. Encrypt all transport, not clients because there's too many of them, but even transport between your floors, your building, between floors in a colo site. If it comes out the network port of your router, you want to encrypt it. It's not that big a deal, and it's not. There's no overhead anymore, and it's integrated in transport equipment. It's pretty easy to do now, where maybe it didn't used to be. If someone else is carrying your traffic, there's encryption as a service. Don't assume that since you use a provider, you can't encrypt. You can. You just say, buy this encryption gear, you encrypt, I keep the keys, and it goes through all their equipment just fine, only you have the keys. So it's really no issue if someone else is carrying your traffic. Encrypt, but don't only rely on IPsec. If you do rely on IPsec, remember strong passwords. And remember that it's not about keeping the secret decoder ring and keeping everything super secret. It's about confidentiality, integrity, knowing that nothing has changed, and then authenticity. Am I connected to who I am connected to, or is someone spoofing who I think I'm connected to. And then intrusion detection, you want to secure your facilities, you want to secure your hardware, but don't forget about your supply chain, because everywhere you buy stuff is a potential point of vulnerability. And then you want to monitor your physical layer. We, as well as other transport vendors, have intrusion detection gear for their physical layer. And then focus on prevention of sideways attacks. Very few people brute force anymore. There's a whole range of sideways attacks, dozens, that can hit any transport link and can make it more vulnerable. So don't think about the big number. Don't be fooled by that master lock with all the numbers on the dial. Think sideways attack. How are people going to try to get into my network, and then try to close those doors? So think sideways. All right, thank you.
Mike Joseph, Google. So one of the problems with transport layer encryption is that you're depending upon your transport provider to maintain your security. And since your traffic is decrypted at every node, that dramatically increases the number of locations where a compromise might occur. If you're relying primarily upon application layer encryption, only the end stations are able to decrypt. It really doesn't matter what's compromised in between. So I'm a little confused as to how moving the encryption into the transport layer would increase security.
Great, that's a very valid question, and thank you for that. It is true, if you're in between nodes, have routers or higher layer gear, the traffic will have to be decrypted. It's going to move up and down. That could be a potential point of vulnerability. We actually do for our data center customers, what's called bookending. And what that is we offer transport solutions to where between point A and point B, the traffic never leaves the fiber. So we are able to put through hybrid Raman ADVA amplification, enough amplification at the sending site and at the receive site that between data centers up to pretty much any intercontinental distance, you guarantee that that traffic never leaves the fiber. And so when you're accessing your information, you're doing it within your own facility where you have control, where you feel comfortable with it. So if your in-between node has routers and you're actually doing stuff there at the higher layers, then I would suggest then it is a point of vulnerability and you need to be securing it. If anything, that's more a case to use transport layer encryption. It's not an additional point of vulnerability. It is a point of vulnerability that must be secured with transport encryption. So if you're not going to the higher layers, you don't need to really break out the encryption. If you are going, it was a vulnerability anyway.
Right, but imagine the thing you're encrypting is some sort of, I don't know, TCP session. And imagine you run this TCP session over something like SSL between your nodes. It really doesn't matter if you do transport security at that point because you're already encrypting the data and you're not really getting any additional value by transport layer security. But if you remove the SSL and you put the encryption at the transport layer, now you've introduced all these additional locations where the data can be potentially decrypted.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. Also, would you
Mike, can I stop you? We got another question behind you. I'd like to give everyone else a chance. Okay, Warren's deferring. That's all you.
And the second question was, would you mind turning to slide 32?
Can someone jump to 32 for me?
You're almost there. There you go. Could you explain the encryption too hard to break concept?
That was so if you look up various pundits of to encrypt or not encrypt, and what levels required, and who should have access and who should have, it almost becomes an ethical question for people who are talking about what society should and should not do. And so what I'm explaining there is that back when IPsec first was being worked on, there was a lot of discussion about, wow, if it is too hard to decrypt such that even nation states, people with almost infinite resources at their disposal, can't get into it, then maybe there's an additional vulnerability for the nation as a whole. That becomes more of an ethics issue. So at the time, there was a lot of discussion, and now it's re-come up again from sort of the different aspect of, wow, is it now too easy to decrypt some of this? And so it's this balancing act of what makes sense. Obviously, I'm just one citizen, one opinion. I think that's something that everyone will have to decide for themselves, and nations on a broader stage will have to kind of decide where they lie on this, on the spectrum, this balancing act.
Okay. I think some people in this room would consider nation states to be one of the threats that against which they protect. But thank you.
Correct.
Matthew?
Matthew Moylecroft from Amazon. I'm just curious, when you do transport encryption, does that raise or lower the risk of an attack because you know how the plain text is arranged, to say the least? If you encrypt with the payload with SSL, then you don't know what form that payload may take. So when you're doing an attack on the encryption, as people have done over many years, you don't know what's inside. But when you encrypt the transport, you know that there are IP packets. You know what IP packets look like. You know what frames look like. You know what the OTU stuff looks like. Doesn't that make it slightly more at risk for attack?
Again, a very valid question, a very good one. I don't think it makes it more apt for attack. If you look at the way we were, I'm not even sure I remember which slide this on. If you look at the way we're doing bulk encryption here, whoops. I'll let you put it back up. If you look at the way we're doing bulk encryption, we're taking the entire container itself, encrypting everything, including the checksum and all the headers. So you may have increased vulnerability at the edges where our equipment is, where you have to understand what's going on. Again, the assumption is it's better to have slightly more vulnerability at the end node where you have control of that, to have less vulnerability between the nodes to where the entire thing is secure. So my argument, or at least my opinion, would be I'd much rather be encrypting at the transport layer on the ends, even though maybe that opened up a little bit of vulnerability there, because I control that, then across the entire transport. So if you look at most attacks that have happened, they haven't been people weaseling into a data center. It's been at the transport nodes. It's been at simple fiber taps. I mean, that is a huge vulnerability point, and I go back to the example.
But if we're encrypting stuff, and you're encrypting the payload only, if you're doing bulk encryption, I know what you're encrypting. I know it encompasses certain frame types and certain headers with MAC addresses and so on. I can make much better guesses about plain text than I can if you're just doing payload. It gives me, as someone who may want to break into it, a much better understanding of what's going on. And I just see the more structure inside what you encrypt, the higher likely it is that you can guess plain text. And this is how people have been breaking into this stuff, I don't know, whenever Bletchley Park was around.
Okay, I fully understand what your argument is and what you're saying. I don't think that's the case, and maybe we can sync up afterwards and walk through that, because the manner in which we're doing the bulk encryption does not lend to that vulnerability. If anything, I look at these other examples above it where only the payload is encrypted, and there it's much easier, especially since the checksum isn't included, to reduce the solution space and understand what's going on. And the manner that we're doing the bulk mode of just taking the whole thing as it's going and making our own framing markers. We're not relying on framing markers inside of it. The whole bulk is flowing through. We don't even care what protocol it is. It doesn't matter. The bulk going through. So in transport, the one above, next to Lasser, yes, you can make that argument. What we're doing is we don't even care what's going through. It's just this junk, and we're flipping things around, and we're making our own framing, and we're able to then reframe at the other end, not relying on the embedded in OTN framing, header and framing, packet framing, anything like that. So in our case, I don't think we have that vulnerability or have that issue. I'd love to talk to you offline about it. Thank you very much for bringing up an important point.
In the middle?
So
Warren Kamari. So this design, is this going to be an open standard, or is this an ADVA to ADVA only thing? Like, is this vendor lock and another light?
Currently, it is only an ADVA product, but I talk here in general about in-flight encryption. Certainly, all transport vendors are coming out or scrambling to come out with their own versions of transport encryption. Given the point-to-point nature, which has already been highlighted, the fact that something's proprietary actually is not as big of a deal as it might be. I imagine once the traditional product cycle will occur to where once everyone has their own proprietary, then you start working together to generalize it and make it less proprietary so that everything can work together. But today, it's proprietary. A lot of our financial customers see that as an advantage, not a disadvantage. They don't want it to be open. They want it to be proprietary. But yeah, to answer your question, for today, it's proprietary.
Michael?
So I'm Michael Sinatra, ESNet. So to follow up on Matt's point, the thing he was getting at was the notion of differential cryptanalysis and how that knowledge of the plain text and knowledge of the ciphertext can allow you to do differential cryptanalysis.
Correct.
So what you need to be able to do in that situation is make sure that you have block cipher methods that properly defend against that. And so cipher blockchaining, CBC encryption is problematic in that space.
Right.
So while I would say, yes, given the fact that there are also unknown unknowns and there are things that are only known to certain TLAs, the notion of guarding against differential cryptanalysis becomes more incumbent on the transport layer because, yes, there is a more structured packet flow that you're going to see there. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what he was trying to get at. I think if you just basically follow that process and make sure that you defend against that as much as you can, mm-hmm. that is one way to help solve that problem.
Yes, thank you. I agree.
Great. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.